Watch these machines for a second. Tanks crawling through the desert, jets slicing the sky. Because in February 1991, this wasn't just a war. It was a live demonstration of a new kind of killing. Night vision and thermal sights turned darkness into daylight. Targets that couldn't even see the shooter were being picked off from kilometers away. And somewhere in Moscow, Soviet officers watched the footage and realized something terrifying. The future had arrived without them. All right, let's get into the story. The satellite phone on General Viktor Kozlov's desk rang at 0243 hours Moscow time, February 24th, 1991. He knew before he picked it up. Nobody called at this hour unless someone was dying or an empire was collapsing, sometimes both. The voice on the other end belonged to Colonel Anatoly Petrov from the GRU's Baghdad station, and he sounded like a man reporting his own execution. "Comrade General, you need to see the footage? Now." Kozlov's office was on the 8th floor of a concrete fortress disguised as an administrative building 3 kilometers from the Kremlin. The walls were thick enough to survive a direct hit from anything short of a nuclear weapon. The windows were reinforced, triple-paned, designed to prevent both eavesdropping and escape. His desk was steel. The chairs were steel. Even the ashtray was steel. Everything in this room had been built to last forever, just like the Soviet Union. He hung up and walked to the secure video room down the hall, his boots echoing in the empty corridor. The night shift guard snapped to attention as he passed. He did not acknowledge them. His mind was already in the desert, 3,000 kilometers away, where Soviet-trained Iraqi tank crews were fighting the Americans with Soviet-designed T-72 tanks using Soviet doctrine, following Soviet tactics. Everything the Red Army had perfected over 5 decades of Cold War preparation was being tested in the sand. And from the tone in Petrov's voice, it was failing catastrophically. The video room was cramped and smelled like cigarette smoke and fear. 4 analysts were already there, hunched over monitors, their faces lit by the cold blue glow of cathode ray tubes. Petrov's grainy image filled the main screen, broadcast via encrypted satellite from a bunker somewhere in Baghdad. Behind him, Kozlov could hear the distant rumble of explosions. "Show me," Kozlov said. Petrov nodded to someone off-screen. The feed switched. What Kozlov saw next would haunt him for the rest of his life. Night vision footage, American, captured from a downed reconnaissance drone according to the file classification in the corner of the screen. The image was monochrome, shades of green and black, but the clarity was shocking. It was night, complete darkness. And yet the camera saw everything. A stretch of desert highway, Iraqi vehicles in formation, T-72 tanks, BMP infantry fighting vehicles, supply trucks. They were moving slowly, cautiously, following the defensive convoy protocols that Kozlov himself had written in 1986. Then the killing started. A flash, bright white in the thermal spectrum. One of the T-72 tanks erupted, not caught fire, erupted. The turret, that massive 12-ton steel dome, separated from the hull and spun through the air like a coin. Before it landed, the second tank was hit, then the third, then the fourth. The entire column was being systematically destroyed, 1 vehicle every 7 to 9 seconds, by an enemy that was not visible in the footage. "Where is the shooter?" Kozlov asked, his voice tight. "Unknown, Comrade General," Petrov replied. "Based on impact angles and the time delay between shots, we estimate 2,000 to 2,500 meters, beyond visual range for our crews." Beyond visual range. That phrase lodged in Kozlov's chest like a shard of ice. The T-72's optical sights were good, excellent even in daylight. But at night? At night, a T-72 gunner was effectively blind beyond 800 meters, and that was under ideal conditions with a full moon and clear skies. In complete darkness, in a sandstorm, they might as well have been aiming with their eyes closed. And right there, The air in the room changes. The footage continued. An American Apache helicopter, invisible in the night, hovered somewhere above the carnage, its targeting pod tracking each kill with mechanical precision. Kozlov watched as 23 Iraqi tanks died in 6 minutes. 23 in 6 minutes. He did the math automatically, the way a tank officer learns to calculate rates of fire and ammunition consumption. One tank destroyed every 15.6 seconds for 6 uninterrupted minutes. How many total? He asked. As of 2 hours ago, coalition forces have destroyed an estimated 1,200 Iraqi tanks, Petrov said. His voice was flat, emotionless, the tone of a man who has already processed the horror and moved into shock. Of those, approximately 840 are T-72 variants. Iraqi losses are catastrophic. American losses are... He paused. Comrade General, as far as we can confirm, the Americans have lost fewer than 20 tanks total, none to enemy fire. The silence in the room was absolute. One of the analysts, a young lieutenant barely out of the Frunz military academy, made a small choking sound. Kozlov turned and looked at him. The boy's face was pale. His hands were shaking. "Get out," Kozlov said quietly. "All of you, except Petrov." They left. The door closed. Kozlov lit a cigarette even though smoking was technically prohibited in the secure video room. He did not care. He needed something to do with his hands, something to occupy the part of his brain that was screaming. "Tell me about the night vision," he said. Petrov's image flickered. The Americans call it thermal imaging. It detects heat signatures instead of light. Every object with a temperature above absolute zero emits infrared radiation. Engines, exhaust systems, human bodies. The American systems convert this radiation into a visual image. In effect, Comrade General, they can see heat. They can see in complete darkness through smoke, through sandstorms. Our crews cannot. Our crews cannot. 3 words. A death sentence for an entire doctrine. Kozlov had spent 34 years in the Red Army. He had commanded a tank company in the Prague Spring. He had written tactical manuals. He had trained Iraqi officers in Baghdad in 1987, serious men who took notes and asked intelligent questions. He had stood in front of the Defense Ministry and assured them that the T-72, when properly employed, could defeat any tank the Americans fielded. He had believed every word. And now those Iraqi officers were dead. Their tanks were burning. And the Americans were hunting in the dark like wolves. He thought about the M1 Abrams, the Americans' new main battle tank. Soviet intelligence had been tracking its development since the late 1970s. The reports had been dismissive. A gas turbine engine that drank fuel like a drunk sailor, overcomplicated electronics, expensive, difficult to maintain. The consensus among Soviet analysts was that the Abrams was a showpiece, a prestige project designed to look impressive in parades and intimidate politicians. It was not a serious weapon for a serious war. They had been catastrophically wrong. "What else?" Kozlov asked. "The Abrams has a stabilized gun platform with a digital fire control system," Petrov continued. "It can fire accurately while moving at full speed. Our T-72s must stop to shoot with any real precision. The Abrams also has laser rangefinders and ballistic computers that automatically calculate range, wind, target movement, and barrel wear. The gunner simply places the reticle on the target and presses the trigger. First shot kill probability is estimated at over 90% at 2,000 meters. First shot kill at 2,000 meters. In the dark, while moving. The T-72's first shot kill probability at 2,000 meters, even in daylight, was maybe 40% under ideal conditions. At night, it was nearly zero. This was not a fight. It was a massacre. It was an industrial slaughter conducted with clinical precision by machines that the Soviet Union could not match. That heavy feeling in your gut? That's the moment. Kozlov stubbed out his cigarette and immediately lit another. His hands were steady. That surprised him. Inside, he felt like he was falling. "The Apache helicopter," he said. "Tell me." "The AH-64 Apache," Petrov recited from memory. "American attack helicopter, crew of 2, carries up to 16 AGM-114 Hellfire. Anti-tank missiles. Each missile has a tandem-shaped charge warhead capable of penetrating any known armor. The Apache's targeting system includes the pilot night vision sensor, a forward-looking infrared system mounted on the nose. It allows the crew to see and engage targets in complete darkness at ranges exceeding 8,000 meters. 8,000 meters, nearly 8 kilometers. A T-72 crew would never even know the Apache was there. They would just die. A flash, an explosion, gone. "How are our crews reacting?" Kozlov asked. Petrov hesitated. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. "Comrade General, morale is collapsing. The Iraqis are abandoning their vehicles. They are surrendering to the first Americans they see. Some are walking into the desert and disappearing. They are terrified. They call the Americans the invisible death. They say the Americans can see their souls. The Americans can see their souls. Poetry from men about to die." Kozlov turned off the monitor. Petrov's face vanished, replaced by blackness. He sat in the dark video room, smoking, thinking. Outside, Moscow was sleeping. Families in their apartments, workers in their factories, soldiers in their barracks. None of them knew yet. None of them understood that the Empire's most fundamental assumption, the bedrock of Soviet military power, had just been shattered in a desert on the other side of the world. The assumption was simple. Soviet weapons were good enough. Not perfect, not cutting edge, but good enough. The AK-47 was not the most accurate rifle, but it was reliable. The T-72 was not the most sophisticated tank, but it was effective. Soviet doctrine emphasized mass over quality, quantity over precision. Build 10,000 tanks instead of 1,000 perfect tanks. Overwhelm the enemy with numbers. It had worked in World War II. It had been the core of Soviet military planning for 5 decades. But the Americans had changed the equation. They had built weapons that could kill from distances where Soviet weapons could not even see. They had built systems so sophisticated that quantity became irrelevant. What good were 10,000 tanks if they could all be destroyed before they fired a single shot? The door opened. Kozlov did not turn around. He knew who it was. Marshal Igor Yazov, defense minister of the Soviet Union, commander of 5 million men, the second most powerful military officer in the country. He closed the door behind him and stood in the darkness. "I watched the footage," Yazov said. And we are obsolete?" Kozlov finally turned. Yazov was 67 years old, a veteran of the Great Patriotic War, a man who had fought at Kursk and Berlin. His uniform was heavy with medals. His face was carved from stone, but in the dim light filtering through the door's small window, he looked old, not tired. Old, as if he had aged a decade in the past hour. "The Americans are not just winning," Yazov continued. "They are demonstrating. They are teaching the world. A lesson. The lesson is, Soviet military technology is a generation behind. Soviet tactics are suicidal. Soviet doctrine is irrelevant. And there's nothing we can do about it. We could develop our own thermal systems," Kozlov said, but even as he spoke, he knew it was pointless. Yazov shook his head. "Development would take 5 years minimum. Production, another 3. We would need microchips, rare earth elements, precision optics. We do not have the industrial base. We do not have the electronics industry. We barely have the budget to keep the army fed." He sat down in one of the steel chairs. "Victor, the Soviet Union is dying. This war in Iraq is just confirming what we already knew. We cannot compete. Not economically, not technologically, not militarily. Nobody says it out loud, but everyone knows. Kozlov crushed his cigarette in the steel ashtray. What will you tell the Politburo? The truth, Yazov said. That Desert Storm is not Iraq's defeat. It is ours. That every assumption we made about modern warfare was wrong. That we spent 40 years preparing to fight World War II while the Americans were preparing for World War III. They will want someone to blame. They will blame me. That is my job. The two men sat in silence. Outside, a distant siren wailed. Ambulance or police. In Moscow, the distinction did not matter much. Kozlov thought about the young Iraqi tank crews he had trained 4 years ago. Boys, really. 18, 19 years old. Eager, respectful. They had asked good questions about Soviet doctrine. They had practiced their formations until they were perfect. They had memorized the manual. And now they were burning in the desert, killed by an enemy they never saw, defeated by a technology they never imagined. There is something else, Yazov said. The Americans are broadcasting this. CNN is showing the footage to the world, the thermal images, the one-sided kills. They are not hiding it. They are advertising it. Psychological warfare. Yes, but not against Iraq. Against us. They are sending a message to Moscow. Look what we can do. Look how far ahead we are. Look how easily we destroyed your equipment and your doctrine. Now imagine what we could do to you. And the message was clear, devastating, final. The Cold War was ending not with a bang, but with a whimper. Not with nuclear fire, but with thermal imaging. Not with courage, but with technology. But the trap wasn't the technology. It was the confidence that had made them blind to it. Kozlov did not go home that night. He stayed in his office, chain-smoking, staring at maps of Central Europe that suddenly felt like artifacts from a museum. Red arrows pointing toward Frankfurt and Paris, defensive lines marked in blue, thousands of small symbols representing tank divisions, mechanized infantry, artillery brigades, the entire choreography of World War III, meticulously planned, endlessly rehearsed, and now completely obsolete. He thought about 1983, 8 years ago, a different world. He'd been a colonel then, assigned to the Kubinka tank proving grounds outside Moscow. His job was testing and evaluation, new armor configurations, upgraded ammunition, incremental improvements to the T-72 and T-64 platforms. One afternoon in May, a young engineer from the Ministry of Defense had arrived with a proposal. His name was Sergei something. Kozlov could not remember his last name now. The man had been thin, nervous, wearing glasses that kept sliding down his nose. Comrade Colonel, he had said, spreading blueprints across Kozlov's desk, I want to propose we develop a thermal imaging system for our tanks. Kozlov had looked at the blueprints. Complex, expensive, the kind of technology that required rare materials and precision manufacturing. Why? The Americans are fielding thermal sights in their new Abrams tank, Sergei said. Intelligence reports indicate they can see in complete darkness. We need to match this capability, or we will be at a severe disadvantage. Kozlov remembered laughing, not cruelly, just dismissively. Comrade, the Americans are fielding a tank that costs $4 million per unit. We produce T-72s for 800,000 rubles. That is the advantage. We will build 10 tanks for every one of theirs. Thermal imaging is a luxury. Soviet doctrine does not require it. But, Comrade Colonel, if they can see us and we cannot see them, then we will use superior tactics and superior numbers, Kozlov had interrupted. This is what we do. This is what we have always done. The Germans had better tanks in 1941. We buried them under waves of T-34s. The principle is the same. Sergei had gathered his blueprints and left. Kozlov never saw him again. He wondered now if the man was still alive, wondered if he was watching the footage from Iraq, wondered if he was thinking, I told you, I warned you. That's when it clicks. It's a game, and they wrote the rules. But in 1983, Kozlov had been confident. The Soviet Union was strong. The Red Army was powerful. The T-72 was a proven weapon, tested in Afghanistan, exported to a dozen countries, respected by Western analysts. And most importantly, Soviet doctrine was correct. It had to be correct. It was built on the lessons of the Great Patriotic War, refined by the greatest military minds in Soviet history. You did not question doctrine. You implemented it. The problem was that doctrine had been written for a different war, a war where visibility mattered less than mobility, a war where mass mattered more than precision, a war where the enemy could see you just as poorly as you could see them. The Americans had broken that assumption. They had created a new kind of warfare, asymmetric and invisible, where one side hunted and the other side died without ever knowing why. The door to his office opened. Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov entered carrying a red folder, another classified report, another confirmation of disaster. Sir, the latest casualty estimates from the Basra highway engagement. Kozlov took the folder, opened it, read the first page, then closed it and set it on his desk next to the others. There were 7 red folders now, 7 separate incidents, 7 massacres. The numbers were numbing. 347 tanks destroyed, 189 armored personnel carriers, 1,240 confirmed dead. And those were just the numbers from 3 days of fighting. Lieutenant, Kozlov said slowly, when you were at the academy, what did they teach you? About night combat? Volkov blinked, surprised by the question. Standard doctrine, sir. Night operations rely on surprise and close engagement. Thermal sights are a Western advantage, but can be countered through tactical aggression and superior positioning. And you believe this? Yes, sir. The instructors were very clear. The instructors were wrong, Kozlov said. Sit down. Volkov sat. He was 23 years old, bright, ambitious, the kind of officer the Red Army needed, but he had been trained with outdated manuals, taught outdated tactics, fed outdated assumptions. He was obsolete before he even graduated. Kozlov pulled out a bottle of vodka from his desk drawer. He poured 2 glasses, pushed one across to Volkov. The lieutenant hesitated. Drink, Kozlov said. That is an order. They drank. The vodka burned. Good. Kozlov wanted to feel something burn. I trained the Iraqi officers, Kozlov said. In 1987, 200 men over 6 months. I taught them Soviet doctrine. I taught them how to use the T-72. I taught them fire and maneuver, defensive formations, combined arms tactics. They were good students, serious, professional. Do you know what I told them when they asked about American technology? Volkov shook his head. I told them not to worry. I told them Soviet equipment was proven. I told them that American tanks were expensive toys for rich countries. I told them that in a real war, with real mud and real dust and real logistics, Soviet simplicity would triumph over American complexity. Kozlov refilled both glasses. I believed every word. And now those men are dead. Burned alive in tanks, I convinced them were invincible. The clock moves. The options shrink. Volkov did not know what to say. In Soviet culture, senior officers did not admit doubt. They did not confess mistakes. They did not show weakness. But Kozlov was past caring about culture. The culture had failed. The system had failed. He had failed. Sir, it is not your fault, Volkov said, quietly. You followed the doctrine. You taught what you were ordered to teach. Exactly, Kozlov replied. I followed the doctrine. I never questioned it. I never asked, what if the Americans are doing something we do not understand? What if our assumptions are wrong? What if we are preparing for the last war instead of the next one? He drained his glass. Following orders is not an excuse, not when the orders are killing people. He stood and walked to the window. Moscow spread out below him, gray and cold under a February sky. Somewhere in this city, the Politburo was meeting. Somewhere, generals were arguing. Somewhere, engineers were being blamed for failures that were not theirs. The Soviet system was very good at finding scapegoats. It was very bad at fixing problems. Do you want to know the worst part? Kozlov said, still looking out the window. We knew. We had intelligence. We had reports from our agents in the West describing the Abrams, describing the thermal systems, describing the fire control computers. We had photographs. We had stolen manuals. We knew what the Americans were building, and we dismissed it. Why? Because it did not fit our worldview, Kozlov said. We believed that war was about courage and endurance and mass. We believed that technology was secondary to tactics. We believed that a well-trained crew in a simple tank could defeat a moderately trained crew in a complex tank. We were wrong. The Americans did not build a complex tank. They built a system, a network, a machine that combined sensors and computers and weapons into something that was more than the sum of its parts. He turned back to Volkov. The T-72 is a tank. The M1 Abrams is a weapons platform. It is a tool for gathering information, processing information, and converting information into dead enemies. It does not matter how brave the T-72 crew is. It does not matter how well trained they are. They cannot fight what they cannot see. Numbers don't lie. People do. Volkov looked down at his hands. What happens now, sir? Now? Kozlov laughed bitterly. Now we pretend. We write reports explaining that the Iraqis were poorly trained, that they did not follow Doctrine properly, that Soviet equipment was misused. We blame the Arabs. We blame Saddam. We blame everyone except ourselves. And then we continue building T-72s because that is what the factories know how to build. And we continue teaching the old doctrine because that is what the instructors know how to teach. And we continue pretending that we are a superpower even as the foundation crumbles beneath us. You do not believe we can adapt? Adapt. Kozlov returned to his desk. Lieutenant, adapting would require admitting we were wrong. It would require completely restructuring our military industry. It would require investing in electronics, in computers, and precision manufacturing. It would require trained engineers in open research and competitive innovation. It would require a system that rewards competence instead of loyalty. It would require... He trailed off. It would require a different country. Volkov stood. Permission to speak freely, sir? Granted. If we cannot adapt, and the Americans have this advantage, then the Cold War is over, Kozlov finished. We lost. We just do not know it yet. The silence stretched. Outside, the city hummed with ordinary life. Trams running, people working, children going to school. None of them knew. The empire would stagger on for a few more months, maybe a year. There would be meetings and speeches and promises of reform. But the heart had stopped beating. The future had been decided in a desert, in the dark, by machines that could see through the night. Kozlov dismissed Volkov and sat alone. He pulled out a photograph from his desk drawer, a black and white image from 1985, a group photo taken in Baghdad. Kozlov standing in the center in his Soviet uniform. Around him, 20 Iraqi officers in their sand-colored fatigues. They were smiling. Young men proud to be learning from the legendary Soviet tank doctrine. Kozlov remembered their names. Captain Hassan, Lieutenant Ahmed, Major Khalid. He wondered which ones were dead. Probably all of them. The phone rang. Kozlov let it ring 4 times before answering. Colonel General Kozlov. He had been promoted. He did not remember when. Ranks did not matter anymore. Comrade General, this is the Defense Minister's office. Marshal Yazov requests your presence at the ministry immediately. Understood. He hung up, put on his coat, straightened his uniform, looked one last time at the photograph of the Iraqi officers. Then he placed it face down in the drawer and locked it. When you look at the numbers, when you strip away the propaganda and the excuses, the truth is simple and brutal. Desert Storm was not a war. It was a demonstration. The Americans showed the world what modern warfare looked like, and everyone who watched understood the same lesson. Soviet military power was a ghost, intimidating from a distance, hollow up close. Kozlov walked through the empty corridors toward the elevator. His boots echoed in the silence. Behind him, his office door remained open. The light stayed on. The maps on the wall showed a war that would never be fought. Outside, Moscow continued its slow, cold morning. And in the desert, thousands of kilometers away, American tanks prowled through the darkness, hunting the last remnants of Soviet doctrine. The invisible death, the Iraqis called it. They were not wrong. The Ministry of Defense building was a monument to Soviet power, 10 stories of reinforced concrete and steel, walls thick enough to survive anything short of Armageddon. Inside, the conference room on the 9th floor had no windows, by design. What was discussed here was never meant to see daylight. Kozlov entered at 0847 hours. The room was already full, 12 generals, 3 admirals, the chief of the general staff, and Marshal Yazov at the head of the table, looking like a man attending his own funeral. Nobody spoke as Kozlov took his seat. The silence had weight. On the table in front of each officer was a red folder, identical, the casualty reports, the kill ratios, the footage, the evidence of their irrelevance. Marshal Yazov stood. "Comrades, we will begin." For the next 40 minutes, Yazov presented the facts. No spin, no propaganda, just numbers. 3,700 Iraqi tanks destroyed, 2,400 armored vehicles, 140 aircraft. The American casualties, 147 dead, 467 wounded. Fewer than 40. Tanks damaged. Zero, absolutely zero, M1 Abrams tanks destroyed by enemy tank fire. One general, a man named Sokolov, who commanded the Moscow military district, interrupted. "These numbers cannot be correct. Iraqi incompetence must... The Iraqis followed our doctrine precisely." Yazov cut him off. "We trained them. We equipped them. We wrote their tactical manuals. Their incompetence is our incompetence." And right there, the air in the room changes. Sokolov's face flushed red. "Comrade Marshal, are you suggesting that Soviet military doctrine is..." "I am not suggesting anything," Yazov said, his voice flat and cold. "I am telling you that our doctrine, our equipment, and our assumptions have been proven obsolete by an enemy who can fight in conditions where we are blind." Another general spoke up. "The thermal imaging. Surely we can develop countermeasures, smoke screens, heat decoys, countermeasures against a system that sees through smoke and sandstorms?" Kozlov interrupted. He had not planned to speak, but the denial in the room was suffocating. "Comrades, this is not a tactical problem. This is a technological gap we cannot bridge. Not in 5 years, not in 10. The Americans have built an electronics industry we do not possess. They have microchip fabrication we cannot match. They have created a military that operates on information, and we are still operating on courage." The room erupted, voices overlapping, accusations, denials. One admiral pounded the table. "We have nuclear weapons. We have strategic missiles. The Americans know we can destroy them." "Yes," Kozlov said quietly, "we can destroy the world, but we cannot win a conventional war. And if we cannot win a conventional war, our nuclear deterrent becomes meaningless, because the Americans now know that they can dismantle our military without ever launching a single missile. This isn't a mistake, it's a design. The truth was worse than defeat. The truth was that the Soviet Union had spent 40 years building the wrong military for the wrong war. They had prepared to refight 1945. The Americans had prepared for 2000. Marshal Yazov held up his hand. The room fell silent. "The Politburo will meet this afternoon," he said. "They will want explanations. They will want solutions. I will tell them the truth, that we lost the Cold War in the Iraqi desert, that American technology has made Soviet military doctrine obsolete, that we cannot compete." They will never accept that, Sokolov said. They will have no choice, Yazov replied, because by next week, every military officer in every country on Earth will have watched the same footage we watched. They will see Soviet equipment burning. They will see Soviet tactics failing. They will draw the obvious conclusion. And our export market, our military influence, our entire geopolitical position will collapse. Now, he was right. Within 6 months, former Soviet client states began shopping elsewhere for weapons. Within a year, the Warsaw Pact was dissolving. Within 2 years, the Soviet Union itself would cease to exist. But sitting in that conference room in February 1991, they did not know that yet. They just knew they had been defeated by an enemy they never saw. The meeting ended. The generals filed out, their faces grim. Kozlov remained seated. Yazov remained standing. "Victor," Yazov said, "do you remember what you said to me in 1979 when we first reviewed the intelligence on the XM1 program?" Kozlov remembered. "I said it was a waste of American money. I said the gas turbine engine was impractical. I said our T-72 was superior." "You believed it?" "I believed all of it." Yazov sat down heavily. "So did I. So did everyone. We looked at the specifications and saw weakness. We should have asked why. Why would the Americans build a tank like this? What do they know that we don't?" He shook his head. "We were arrogant. We thought we had solved warfare. We thought mass and doctrine and courage were enough. We never imagined that information could be a weapon. When a country collapses, people shrink first." Kozlov stood. "I failed those Iraqi officers, Comrade Marshal. I trained them to die." "You trained them using the system we gave you," Yazov replied. "We all failed them. The entire Soviet military establishment failed them, and now we will fail our own soldiers unless we admit the truth and change everything." But they would not change everything. They would not admit the truth. The Soviet system was incapable of the kind of radical self-examination required. The empire would stagger on for 20 more months, issuing reforms that meant nothing, making promises it could not keep, pretending that the foundation was still solid even as the walls crumbled. Kozlov left the ministry and walked into the cold Moscow morning. Snow was falling, light, dry flakes that melted on contact with the pavement. He thought about Sergei, the nervous engineer from 1983 who had tried to warn him. He thought about the young Iraqi lieutenant who had asked him, "Comrade General, what if we face an enemy we cannot see?" He thought about all the warnings, all the signs, all the opportunities to ask hard questions that had been ignored because the answers were inconvenient. The Americans didn't just win with technology, they won with philosophy. They won because their system rewarded innovation, encouraged questioning, and tolerated failure as part of learning. The Soviet system rewarded obedience, discouraged dissent, and punished failure with exile or death. You cannot innovate in fear. You cannot adapt in rigidity. You cannot win the future by clinging to the past. So who's actually winning here? Kozlov walked for an hour through the streets of Moscow, past the Kremlin, past the gum department store, past the Bolshoi Theater. All the monuments of Soviet power, grand and impressive and hollow. He watched ordinary people going about their ordinary lives. They did not know yet. They would learn soon enough. By evening he was home, a small apartment, 2 rooms. His wife Irina was cooking dinner. She looked at his face and knew. "It's over, isn't it?" she said. "Yes." She nodded. Set the table. They ate in silence. Later, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, Kozlov thought about the future. Not his future, the world's future. A future where wars would be fought and won before the soldiers even saw each other. A future where information was deadlier than ammunition. A future where the side that could see would always defeat the side that was blind. The Americans had created that future in the desert, and the rest of the world was still catching up. If you've ever wondered how empires end, it's not always with a bang. Sometimes it's with a thermal image, A green and black video of tanks burning in the night. A revelation that everything you believed was wrong. The Cold War didn't end in 1991 when the Soviet flag came down. It ended in February, in the Iraqi desert, when American night vision turned darkness into day and the Soviet doctrine into ashes. The invisible death won. Invisibility, it turned out, was everything.